was considered and rejected in the White House. "6 hours after the supposed attack, a retaliation against North Vietnam was ordered by President Johnson. American jets bombed 2 naval bases. A major oil facility was also destroyed. 2 U.S. aircraft were lost in the raids. Within hours of the American airstrikes, the Chinese Premier Chou En-lai was calling on the Vietnamese to prepare to fight back. Chinese air units on the Vietnam border were heavily reinforced. Frantic efforts were made to improve North Vietnam's anti-aircraft defenses. At the same time, jets of the fledgling North Vietnamese Air Force returned to Vietnam from their training base in China. The same day that North Vietnamese fighters began operations from their new home airfield, an historic step was taken in Washington. On August 7, 1964, the U.S. Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It gave President Johnson the freedom to take whatever actions he thought necessary to defend Southeast Asia. Johnson now had the power to use military force in Vietnam in almost any way he chose. In North Vietnam, there was a growing fear that the United States meant to deploy troops in the south and perhaps even invade the north itself. The U.S. might also decide to bomb North Vietnam into the ground. Communist leaders could only hope that fear of China would make the enemy hesitate before taking any drastic steps. Meanwhile, a bold stroke might win the war in the South before the Americans could intervene. The plan was that the North Vietnamese army should be sent to fight in the South. Supplying them would be no easy task, but their well-trained and heavily armed regiments just might tip the balance. The aim was to topple the weakened South Vietnamese state within little more than a year. The first North Vietnamese Army units to be raised and trained for combat in the South were the 32nd and the 33rd Regiments of the 325th Division based at Dong Hoi. The 66th Regiment of the 304th would follow next. The plan was that starting in October, the troops would march for 6 weeks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and enter South Vietnam's Central Highlands in early 1965. The first step would be to seize territory in the border area. At the same time, the Viet Cong would take over the coastal provinces of Quang Ngai and Bien Dinh. The NVA would then advance along the line of Highway 19 between Pleiku and Quy Nhon, splitting South Vietnam in two. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong would mount big attacks in the Mekong Delta and around Saigon. Victories there would open the way for a general offensive and trigger the popular uprising which would sweep away the Saigon government. While the North Vietnamese Army prepared its divisions for infiltration into the south, the NLF stepped up their campaign. One of their main aims now was to deter the United States from getting more deeply involved in the war. With the U.S. presidential election coming up, reminding Americans that intervention had a price just might pay dividends. On November 1st, 1964, only 2 days before the election, Ben Hoa Air Base near Saigon was blasted by Viet Cong mortars. 4 Americans were killed and 76 wounded. 5 B-57 bombers were destroyed and 15 damaged. Although the attack seemed a blatant provocation, President Johnson was determined not to react in a way that might endanger his election chances. His restraint seemed to have paid off handsomely when, on November 3, 1964, he resoundingly defeated his rival, Barry Goldwater. By now, Johnson's advisors feared that South Vietnam could be on the brink of collapse. From January 1, 1965, through to February 7, 1965, the Viet Cong mounted a series of coordinated attacks across the country. They took and held the village of Binh Gia, only 40 miles from Saigon, severely mauling government army units sent to the rescue. Altogether, 200 government troops were killed near Binh Gia, along with 5 American advisors. The battle culminated in a devastating ambush that almost wiped out a relief column of elite South Vietnamese Army Rangers. In Washington, the pressure to do something to save South Vietnam was now intense. Although Johnson doubted that bombing North Vietnam could dissuade it from supporting the Viet Cong guerrillas, he agreed to let military planners prepare a major campaign. Meanwhile, a series of strikes would be launched as reprisals if there was any major attack by the Viet Cong. The provocation came on February 7, 1965. A U.S. helicopter base and advisory compound in the central highlands of South Vietnam was attacked by NLF commandos. 9 Americans were killed and more than 76 were wounded. Johnson ordered immediate retaliation, and U.S. Navy fighter bombers were launched to attack military targets just inside North Vietnam. Only 3 days after the U.S. raids, there was another attack by the Viet Cong on Americans. This time, it was a bomb in a hotel at Quy Nhon, which killed 23 U.S. servicemen. More retaliation strikes were launched, and on February 13, 1965, President Johnson authorized a bigger campaign, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder was to be a limited but long-lasting offensive. Its aim was to force North Vietnam to stop supporting the guerrillas in the south. As Operation Rolling Thunder got underway, the chief of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Saigon, General William C. Westmoreland, grew increasingly worried about the security of bases involved in the campaign. Da Nang, sited in a largely hostile area and guarded by a small Vietnamese army unit, was particularly vulnerable to Viet Cong attack. Westmoreland asked for 2 battalions of U.S. Marines, 3,500 men, to be deployed around the base. On March 8, 1965, a battalion of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade went ashore at Da Nang. The 2nd Battalion would arrive later by air. The Marines' mission was to be strictly confined to defending the Da Nang base. However, even as the troops were landing, General Harold K. Johnson, the Army Chief of Staff, was already in Saigon to talk about much bigger deployments. General Johnson had been appointed by the President his special representative. His mission was to prompt General Westmoreland and U.S. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor to say what troops they needed to win the war. In fact, General Johnson and his fellow commanders on the Joint Chiefs of Staff already had a clear idea of the forces they wanted for Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs' wish was for 3 divisions, around 70,000 men. That was the number called for in their defense plan for Southeast Asia, Operation Plan 32. The plan had been designed to meet an invasion of South Vietnam from the north or China, something that no one now expected to happen. However, as part of the plan, airfields, communications, and other facilities had already been put in place. Now, large numbers of troops could be deployed as soon as the President gave the order. It was American public opinion that most worried President Johnson. He was determined to move slowly on sending more men to Vietnam. He agreed to another 3,000 Marines and 20,000 logistics and support troops to prepare for further deployments. But for the moment, that was as far as he would go. On April 7, 1965, at Johns Hopkins University, President Johnson offered economic aid to North Vietnam in exchange for peace. His offer was brusquely rejected by the North Vietnamese government. Two weeks later, Johnson agreed to raise U.S. combat strength in Vietnam